Now it's time to review the AMD R5 7600X. We've already looked at the 7950X. You should check out that review for the foundational information, like the fact that these CPUs will boost to 90 to 95 degrees Celsius by design, and you're going to need to accommodate that with a higher end cooler, even down at the R5 level. This CPU, sadly, has basically completely lost our recommendation in the R5 class. Since the 1600 now, we've been saying the R5s are a good place to go for the best value, where they were closer to 200 bucks. With the 5600X, we were still kind of on board at $300, but now AMD's completely lost us, and it's because the motherboard price, the DDR price, and the CPU price, and the cooler price. We need a better one now because it's higher power, the power supply price as well, because that's higher power capacity. All of it comes together to just destroy the value of what used to be a stronghold for AMD in the value market. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Crucial and its DDR5 memory for Intel or AMD Ryzen CPUs. Crucial makes DDR5 kits that are deployable in Ryzen 6000 laptop systems and in Ryzen 7000 systems or Intel Alder Lake, including both budget-oriented and performance-based memory modules. If you're building a new system, click the link in the description below to learn about Crucial DDR5 memory. So the 7600X is a 6-core, 12-thread part. Again, $300. Motherboard prices, want to be very clear, we do not get the full list of motherboards and all the prices before launch. We've asked, we don't have it. The most I know right now is that the boards we have a couple of them in-house, more than a couple actually, but and they range from about $400 or $500 up to 600 something. That is insane, obviously, for a 7600X. So we started asking, what's the cheapest board? And we haven't heard of anything below the 300s right now. Not 300, 300s. Somewhere in that range. I'm not getting specific answers. It's very frustrating as a reviewer because it makes it hard for me to make a value judgment if I don't know a key figure to what makes the value. So all we can work off of is if you're buying a $300-something motherboard, $300 CPU, and then DDR5 and a better cooler because it boosts to 95 degrees Celsius, and that's normal. Any cooler will stick at 95C, so okay, but you still do need more power to cool it and get the full amount out of the CPU, so it feels kind of bad to not buy up. All those things together, in a bit of a ranty way, is contributing to the destruction of a class of CPU that, to us, is just sad. It's disappointing because the R5s have been such a stronghold and they've done so well to establish AMD. It's like AMD has sort of forgotten what got it to where it is today with Zen, which is the R5 CPUs, and it's gone. Now, there is a point of hope here, which is that AMD technically said eventually motherboards will start at $125 or so in at least the B series. The B series, we don't have anything for. We don't have any prices for either. But we're a little concerned about what the quality is going to look like on a $150 modern motherboard for AM5 based on the quality we're seeing for the high-end stuff at $500. Like, they're fine. It's just it's not what you used to get for 500 bucks. And okay, the market shifts, but then so does the value. And that's fair play. So that's what we're going to be looking at really closely today is the value. We'll get into more discussion on this in the conclusion, but we need to walk you through all the numbers first as objectively as we can. We'll talk about opinions at the end. So let's get started. Counter-Strike Go showed good scaling in our 7950X, so it's back here. In this one, the 7600X lands second place on the chart, and at a significant discount from the 7950X, despite a price hike over the likes of the R5 3600 and competing with the cheaper 12600K or 12400. The 7950X holds a lead of 14% over the 7600X, with the 7600X ahead of the 12900K by just 2%, while maintaining stronger 0.1% lows. However, there's a wide standard deviation and 0.1% lows for this game, so those don't matter as much as normally. The generational jump over the 5600X is 20%, from 320 FPS to 383 FPS average, with the jump over the 3600 at 67% improved. Looking at this another way, the i3-12100F achieves 67% of the total performance of the R5 7600X while being 33% of the price. And that's before factoring in the cheaper cost of the motherboard and of DDR4, which on the 12100F has about the same performance. So if you're looking for something that just gets the job done, the 12100F remains the best option there. But the 7600X has a clear advantage and a meaningful one. At 1440p, the results are all the same, and that's a good thing. That's because we're entirely CPU bound, meaning the GPU is not limiting us here. The 7600X has the same performance as before, landing slightly ahead of the 12900K, so there's no change to speak of, and we can just move on. Now it's time for Rainbow Six Siege. Once again, we still haven't hit 1000 FPS, or, as we're calling it from here forward, a kilo FPS. Sort of like the amount of power you'll need to pull to run these systems. The 7600X ran at 603 FPS average, with lows well paced at 391 and 330. Frame time consistency is in good shape here. The 7950X is within error at 0.7% ahead, establishing what everyone already knew, that the 7950X is for production, not gaming, and so it's an absolute waste for anyone who is only doing this type of workload. For what it's worth, Intel manages a technical but unnoticeable lead, and so does the 5800X 3D. The 7600X leads the 5600X's minuscule and totally unplayable 543 FPS average by 11%, with the 7600X over the 3600 by 54%. Now, although that's actually pretty impressive, one thing we really want to make sure everyone's clear on as we get through all these new and shiny CPUs and GPUs coming up is that even though the gains are good, if you are still happy with your system right, this is where you need to stop if you're thinking of upgrading and ask yourself this question. If you're still happy with your system right now as it's built today, you don't have any real reasons to complain, just keep using it. You don't need to just buy the newest thing just because it's better, because that's always going to happen. And we just like to drop in these reminders because people get really caught up in the hype. And realistically, if you're pretty happy with what you have, and the money would mean more to you than the joy from building a new computer right now, then you can always wait till later. So anyway, at least for Rainbow Six so far though, it's looking pretty good. Far Cry 6 is more graphically limited. However, there's still scaling between all of these CPUs. The 7600X's 164 FPS average has it just ahead of the cheaper 12600K, leading by 5.8%. The 7600X also leads the 5600X's 131 FPS average result by 25%, and with better 1% and 0.1% lows. The 3600 is improved on by 53%, similar to the last test. As for value, the 7600X at $300 is better than the 5600X at $300, which is what it launched at. It's not available at that now, but at least that's improvement generationally. The 12600K is getting most of the performance though, and at $30 cheaper, while also supporting DDR4. If you're looking for the cheapest option, the 12100F is still the leader in the sort of playable but cheap category, although 13th gen will shake things up. Lows on the 7600X are better than we saw on the 7950X due to the scheduling problems with high core count CPUs in Far Cry. Doesn't make it unplayable, it just creates the 0.1% number that you're seeing. So overall, the 7600X's gains over the last few generations are pretty good versus, say, the 3600, even though it shares a name with an Intel CPU from almost a decade ago now. It is close in competition to the 12600K, but the price is not that different between the two of them, and obviously things will shake up more than we can predict right now with Raptor Lake coming up, but even the cost difference at the moment is relatively minor, other than that startup cost for the board and the memory if you're going with AM5, because it forces you into DDR5. Final Fantasy XIV's Shadowbringer benchmark is next. This is new to our test suite. We're using the pre-packaged benchmark, and this performance will vary when connected to things like servers, if you're actually playing the MMO, and in different areas of the game. Still shows scaling, but because this is a network-attached game, we have to use the built-in benchmark instead. The 7600X ran at 224 FPS average and had frame times consistently paced. The 12700KF and the 12900K both end up ahead this time, and the 7950X is functionally tied, basically error run to run though. Versus the 12600K, the lead is about 4%, then 20% over the 12100F, and 24% over the 5600X. Against the old guard 3600, the lead is 54% in the 76X, which is consistent with the last few tests. Given the 7950X and 5950X here, the benchmark appears to drop some frames when going too high in core count for Zen, but we'd have to research it more to really be sure. Tomb Raider brings us back again to more constrained scenarios, but still with scaling most of the way up the stack. The 7950X leads the 7600X by 3%, with the 7600X over the 12900K by just a couple FPS. The 12600K runs at 223 FPS average, giving the 7600X a 14% lead, while both maintain proportionally scaled lows. Generationally, we're seeing a gain of about 16 to 18% against the 5600X, And the 3600, if you're upgrading from that, you can expect to see closer to, at least in this benchmark, something like a 68% improvement. So large jump there if you're going back as far as 3000, 2000, or 1000 series. And we have the 1700 in there too if you wanted a anchor point to the 1000 series. At 1440p, we see complete GPU binds on everything. We're stuck at 200 FPS, meaning that everything from the 5600X and all the way up to the top is considered the same and cannot be compared properly here because the parts are being limited by something else. That's not under test, that's the GPU. The dose of reality is that a GPU limited scenario makes the CPU choice matter a lot less. In F1 2022 at 1080p, the 7600X ran at 342 FPS average, meaning the 7950X has just a 3% lead here. The 7600X leads the 12900K in this one, to give credit to AMD's marketing team, and it's by about 6%. It's not bad when considering the price gap. Compared to cheaper stuff, the 12600K's 287 FPS average allows it to achieve 84% of the performance of the 7600X, but it costs 90% of the price, so the scaling still makes sense. At 1440p, the 7600X ran at 297 FPS average and lost headroom due to the GPU limitation. This means everything on the top half of this chart is similar in experience, with the top third being basically identical. We also had Cyberpunk, Total War Warhammer 3, and GTA tested, but as discussed in the 7950X review, we're basically GPU bound at the top of those charts. That makes them useless as games for a CPU review in comparison with these settings, but useful if you want to play them since you know you'll just need a better GPU more than anything else. So that's all the gaming tests. Now it's time to get into the production tests, and these ones are really fun because they're pretty easy. They're very one-dimensional. It's normally just represented in time and minutes, if not things like millions of instructions per second or something. So the R5 CPUs have historically been, they're very strong here initially in like the 2600 era, and then Intel started clawing back some ground. Let's see how AMD does now versus stuff like a 12600K. We'll start with Blender, the tile-based renderer. We use a custom in-house made animation that's specifically designed to stress the CPU. Coarse scale in a predictable way here, with more threads getting clear and ever-present performance uplift. The 7600X took 15.8 minutes to completely render one frame of our animation, which has it right between the 5800X, within error, and the 12600K, outside of error and 9% ahead. The 7600X doesn't post big enough generational gains without the cores to outpace anything in the R9 class previously, and it falls behind the 12600K. So this lands it in the category of predictable and acceptable, but not impressive. That seems to be the trend with this CPU in production test though, because back before Intel was competing closely, so basically 4 years, AMD R5 CPUs were consistently besting it and at lower prices. Now, or at least for the last generation, they're closer to parity. The lead over the 5600X though is 30%, with the lead over the 3600 less impressive but still large at 34%. The next chart is for power efficiency, or effectively performance per watt. Eco mode can benefit AMD here at the cost of performance, but we won't be going into that in this review. We hope to have some of that data in our 7950X review, and if it doesn't make it before launch, we'll run a standalone piece. Performance is calculated as a simple watt-hours equation. What we're judging is how much power does it take to complete an equivalent amount of work between all of these CPUs. Our control is the amount of work produced, rendering one frame, and the variables here are time and power. So it's basically a look at the unit of work produced versus the unit of time consumed. The 7600X ends up in the middle of the pack. It calculates to 30.5 here with our formula, meaning that it is more efficient per frame rendered in Blender than the R5 3600, but not by much, and less efficient than the R5 5600X from last generation. Although the 7600X is faster than the 5600X overall, the power differential to complete that work has the 5600X far more efficient, and the 5950X the most impressive of all. On to Chromium code compile testing. This benchmark indicates how long it takes to compile a code base, which is useful for programmers who do frequent or large builds. The AMD R5 7600X required 82 minutes to complete the build, which has it between a 12600K at about $270 and the R7 5800X. That's 7% uplift versus the R7 of a previous generation. However, the 5800X is currently $260. Obviously, its starting point was higher for price than the 7600X's starting price, but today it's lower. At least, though, it's progress generationally for the launch performance and price. Compared to the R5 5600X, the more relevant comparison, the reduction in compile time is 30%, with the reduction versus an R5 3600 at 31% reduced. 3600 did pretty well here. In this test, the 7600X really isn't that impressive. It's worse than the 12600K, which holds an 8% lead at a lower cost and can reduce the cost even further if you do DDR4 in the 12600K. There are other advantages to the 7600X, it's just they're not here. File compression is up next, tested with 7-zip. This is measured in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS. Here, the 7600X ran at 97,000 MIPS, and that puts it marginally ahead of the 12600K with a 1.7% lead and behind the 3900X. Compared strictly to the 12600K, the 7600X lacks value proposition despite its slight lead. As expected, this $300 price tag has AMD in a precarious position against the inbound 13th gen CPUs from Intel. The lead over the previous generation 5600X is 31%, or about 61% improvement over the R5 3600. As for newer stuff, the 7950X is a clear chart leader and by a massive margin, but it's also a lot more expensive. And you can check our previous review for more detail on that. Decompression testing spaces things out a bit more. In this test, the 7600X ends up behind the 5800X and the X3D, showing that the extra cores, even on hardware one generation older, are more beneficial than the pure architectural improvements of the Ryzen 7000 series. The 7600X is 11% ahead of the 12600K, establishing a far more distinct advantage than in compression. Time for our mortal enemy, the Adobe software suite. We'll start with Adobe Premiere. In this, we score the aggregate performance of filters, transforms, live playback and scrubbing, rendering, and more with the Puget suite. The 7600X scores 888 points overall, which has it about tied with the R7 5800X and its 2 additional cores. Compared to the 5600X prior, the generational uplift is a noteworthy 21% or 30% over the R5 3600. The 12600K leads by 5% over the 7600X, matching some of the other production tests. Overall, the 7600X is competent for Premiere, but not in a particularly strong or impressive position. It's more than adequate as a CPU for Premiere work, in addition to your normal gaming functions, if you just want to be able to cut together some easy videos, but not as your primary job or use for the computer. Photoshop is up now. Intel used to hold a disproportionately strong lead here, but that's evaporated and flipped over the years. In this test, the 7950X remains the leader. But as a reminder from that review, it's not much different from the competing 12900K. The 7600X is nearly identical to the 12900K as well, but with the price at $300 versus $580 for the 12900K. The new AMD CPU is a far better value here, and this is one of the places where it actually looks pretty good, at least compared to Intel. Generationally, the 7600X ends up leading the 5950X here, as well as the 5600X at 33% ahead of that one. The lead over the 3600 is 66%, so this lines up with the previous results. Time to talk about thermal behavior again. We went over this in depth in the 7950X review, so go check that out for the details. The short of it is that the 7600X also boosts to 90 to 95 degrees Celsius under functionally any non-extreme cooling. And that includes our 360ml liquid freezer 2 at 100% fan speeds. That's normal, but it'll be harder to tell if you're actually thermal throttling now. You'll need to check the frequency in addition to the thermals because, again, this is by design. Speaking of, here's the frequency. The 7600X boosts to an impressive 5200 to 5225 megahertz, the highest we've seen out of the Ryzen 7000 CPUs. If we're testing a game that's truly limited in thread and cache utilization, this CPU may score higher just from the frequency alone. Single core frequency had the 7600X at a completely flat line of 5450 megahertz, as opposed to the 7950X's 5750 that had plus or minus some change. This will fluctuate based on silicon quality and motherboard, so other CPUs will have some variance. On to power testing for the R5 7600X CPU. This one at 6 cores and 12 threads and generally a lower TDP will consume less power than we saw with the 7950X and what we will see with the 7900X. It still, however, is higher power draw than the 5600X previously, which was well below 100 watts, depending on how you set it up. So let's take a look at the chart. Here's the all-core power consumption with Blender. The 7600X consumes about 116 watts under this workload, putting it on par with the 108 watt 5800X3D or the Intel i5 12600K. They've definitely scaled power consumption with performance this generation, but at least it's a lot easier to cool than the 7950X. That said, it's clear now why AMD got rid of its stock coolers. The old R5 5600X sits at 67 watts and it remains one of the most effective gaming CPUs for the power envelope that we've tested. That can be cooled with the stock cooler, whereas this one would struggle a bit. Single core power consumption has the 7600X at 30 watts, which is right between the 10600K and the R7 2700. The 5600X was at 22.8 watts in our testing previously. So concluding then, entry price is extremely high here. You're dealing with motherboards that the ones we have are, we don't have the exact final prices on them yet, but one of the boards we have is like $600. And the other one is in the high, I think it's mid 400s or something like that. We've heard of boards coming that are supposed to be in the 300s. Haven't really personally seen or worked with anything that's cheaper than that though, and it just doesn't make sense to buy a $300 R5 CPU and put it in even a $300 motherboard. That's far too much. It's just blown way out of proportion, the distribution of cost there. So that's the biggest problem that AMD has right now with the R5 7600X. And that's the thing that you're forced into DDR5 as well. The price is coming down, to be fair, but it's still higher on average than DDR4. And plus things like the cooler cost, where the coolers before, the stock AMD ones, they weren't particularly good, but at least it came with one if you needed to save a couple bucks while you got your build off the ground. And now you're gonna have to buy something where a bigger cooler is actually going to affect the frequency. And although it might not be significant, like say, if you're talking 100 megahertz from the best versus acceptable, not the biggest loss, it's still something that a lot of people are gonna really, I think, struggle to willingly hinder the performance, even if it's say a 50 megahertz or 100 megahertz, where they know they're throwing something away for savings of whatever, 70 bucks or something. And although we think it would be worth it to save that money on this class of CPU, it still feels kind of bad to do it when you're throwing away performance knowingly. So this CPU is in a very rough spot for pricing when you look at the whole picture of everything. Motherboards, we don't know the pricing of anything cheap yet. AMD's been fairly tight about motherboard costs. We know eventually there'll be B-series boards that are supposed to start as low as $125 or something. But you know, like, we've got boards here behind me where they don't even have basic features like debug codes, and they're hundreds of dollars, which is insane. So that's where the market is right now. And I think for this one, you're gonna have to wait for those B-series boards and see what comes out before it really starts to make sense financially to buy a $300 6-core 12-thread CPU. Weirdly, one of the few CPUs we have extremely consistently recommended from AMD, which is the R5 class, it's like now it's gone. It does well, the CPU itself that is, it's just that the value proposition got blown out of the water by all the other costs that go into the platform as a starting point. And if the motherboard quality, such that it is right now that we've seen it, is proportional at $150 and $200 to what we're seeing at 300 plus, we don't have a lot of faith in getting a very nice motherboard, at least compared to previous generations, for similar costs. So it is in a bad spot, strictly in terms of the value, the price positioning. I think everyone knew that coming into this launch too, based on the comments we saw with the AMD news announcement. So that's rough. Now, as far as just quickly recapping the performance, so the 12100F, it's a $100 CPU. You can get boards for it that are pretty good for a 12100F, like in the $100 to $200 price range. And that gets 67% of the performance at 33% of the price, not even counting DDR4 and needing a lower end cooler being completely acceptable, a cheaper one, and the motherboard being cheaper. So it might be more like 20% of the price once you add all those in. And those numbers we just gave you, that's for CSGO. So that is one of the least CPU bound scenarios that we've tested. Makes a lot more sense as a value proposition. Some other quick numbers here, just recapping for you. So in Rainbow Six, we saw the 7600X has about a 50-something% lead, 54. So over the 3600 previously. Far Cry 6, it leads the 12600K by about 5 to 6%, not that exciting. And the 5600X by 25% in that game. 3600 by 53% in that game. Tomb Raider, we saw a lead of 18% over the 5600X and 68% over the 3600, and then 14% over the 12600K. So that's a quick recap of the numbers. Blender, it was like 9% ahead of the 12600K, and it needs all of those expensive things. So the CPU, strictly as a CPU, does pretty well. It's just that as soon as you factor in value, it loses us. So weirdly, this is the one that we don't particularly like this generation. It's not because of the CPU, it's just doesn't make sense for what it would cost to build a computer with this CPU in it. Hopefully that's clear, because normally we've liked the R5s, but this is the one we have the strongest negative opinion about this time. I haven't looked at the 7700X numbers yet, but 7950X, 7900X, we have those reviews. One's already up, the other one is coming up after this. At this point I have filmed it, and we are more positive-ish on the 7900X than we are on this thing, because at least at the higher end, you're skewing the value so much anyway by investing or buying in a high-end CPU that things like motherboard and memory cost feel less out of place. So AMD, to get us back on board with the R5s, you know, it's been a good run. Since the 1600, we've liked the R5s, and it's always been like, when we come up on these reviews, we look at it knowing we're going to review this one on day one, and we're going to review some other one on day one, and at least the R5 we know is going to be a positive review, even if this other one, whatever it is, ends up being negative, and they've lost it. Now it's kind of the leaning negative one, all because of that price point. So 7600X is a pass from us for now, until the pricing looks better on motherboards, and maybe that'll change on launch day. They haven't communicated much to us, but from what we've seen, it is bad. It is very pricey for stuff that is absolutely nowhere near the price that they're asking for it in terms of value to an R5 CPU. Thanks for watching. Skip this one for now. Consider it later when the B series comes out, and subscribe for more. As always, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus if you want to just chip in a few bucks to help us out directly in the next round of tests. Thank you very much for that, and we'll see you all in the next one.